So, good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Climate Change Media Hub session, the Asian College of Journalism in partnership with Interlink Academy, Germany. And today we have two speakers to speak on the role of gender and how important it is to report on climate change using gender as a lens. And I invite Bharti. I'm happy to have Bharti Sadashivam and Seema Kulkarni, both of whom I know for some time, as speakers, and they have extensive experience in policy and on the ground, working with women and gender issues on a global and a local level. So I hope you will enjoy this session, and I invite Bharti to speak first. Bharti and I know each other since we worked in UNI for in I think since the 1980s. But just to introduce you formally to her, she's a policy analyst and has worked with the UN for decades. And She has about 35 years experience in the UN, NGOs, and in journalism. And she's a regional gender advisor for UNDP, or was at its Istanbul regional hub. And she led a number of programs in 18 country offices in Europe and Central Asian region. She was also a gender justice program director at the Women's Environment and Development Organization. So, as I told you, she began her career as a journalist and spent a wonderful year in Paris at the Journalists en Europe program in the 90s. She's a very good feature writer, and she's one of the best persons I could think of to advise you, especially on reporting and climate. And she's now a writer and editor based in Chennai, and she's published several articles on gender development and human rights. So, Bharti, I look forward to your presentation. Please feel free to talk for about 15-20 minutes, and then followed by Seema, and then we can take questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Presentation, please. So what I'd like to say in my presentation is what is the importance of the role of rural women in agriculture and in climate, and why is it that we need to pay attention to this? So first of all, first slide, please. So the first slide that the few points I wanted to make to start with is that agriculture in India, by some accounts for about 40% of all methane emissions. And both from the point of employment and from the point of climate action, we need to consider women and women's roles, because women are about the backbone of the agricultural workforce, as we will see in the following slides. And overall, given farming and all the associated sectors, it employs a huge number of women. So by some accounts, it is 40 to 60% women are of the entire agricultural workforce, and also about 80% of all economically active women. In recent years, as we all know, there's been quite a bit of migration out of agriculture to non-farm jobs by men, also some women, but increasingly by men. And this has led to a lot of what they call the feminization of agriculture, which means women taking on a lot of roles in agriculture that they did not do before. When it comes to livestock, this was quite an interesting finding as well, which is that also a very big emitter of methane and a large component of agriculture is livestock, and it's almost fully handled by women, all the different stages of dairy farming. As we know from the recent extreme events that we've had in India, a lot of climate disasters are water related. And because of gender and social norms, more women and girls in rural areas tend to lose their lives or are much more endangered than men in climate-induced flooding. Next slide, please. So why should we look, so how can we look at some of the ways in which climate change affects women farmers in particular? So first, let's begin with the fact that there are very sizable gender gaps in income in agriculture and agri-food systems. As we know, there are gender pay gaps for women throughout the economy, not just in agriculture, but it's very, very pronounced in agriculture because most women don't own land. They lack land title and registration. They tend to get paid much less than men. There was a very good article on this in the Hindu recently. And it's also globally, as well as in India, women tend to work as contributing family workers, which means they are unpaid family workers. So women's workload is not just in farming, but also all the work they do at home, care work of the children and the elderly, housework. All this increases dramatically during extreme weather events, whether this is heat stress or flooding or extended temperature rises, and because of men's migration. So what we are seeing in terms of women's workload is that it's gone up, it keeps going up exponentially. And there's also data now recently to show that rural women-headed households lose much more than men from the same factors, the heat, the drought, the flooding, because they have much less coping strategies. And when it comes to fuel and for cooking, and a lot of women use biomass. So when you have deforestation, women-led households suffer in particular. And they will also suffer also from afforestation, because that means certain types of land from which they access biomass is out of bounds for them. So then also in terms of the gender gaps and the economic gender gaps means that they have much less access to irrigation, to seeds, to technology, to credit from institutions, crop insurance, all the things that are integral to being a farmer. There is no guarantee that women have the same access to it as men. When it comes to climate-related diseases and nutrition, it just is much harder for women to have the same health parameters as men, and they're much more vulnerable to certain types of vector-borne and waterborne diseases because of the nature of work they do. They also have to face a lot of challenges in actually doing the daily housework because of the climate change impacts that we just talked about. And finally, you have persistent social and gender norms. And we all know what these are. They're pervasive all over India because we're a patriarchal society. And these have many ramifications for rural women. In particular, especially in health and nutrition, when in a cereal-based diet, women will have much less access to a diverse food plate when it like cereal, like pulses and proteins and other things. And they have much less autonomy to move, to take proactive roles, and to have coping strategies that really supports them in their work. Next slide, please. So yes, so women have very definite, undeniable vulnerabilities. And gender inequalities, which are pre-existing, amplify women's vulnerability to climate change impacts. But what I want us all to remember is that women are not a vulnerable group. It's very, very common to use this kind of phrasing when we talk about women in general in any development context. But as women are half the population of the world, they're not a vulnerable group. They experience vulnerabilities which are systemic, structural, or social, but it's really important to remember that women are not victims. Why? Because as we just saw, agriculture in India is women's work. So they have the strength to do all the sowing, planting, weeding, and harvesting, which are all very much given to women. Even though you have this iconic image of the male farmer in India, a lot of the hard work in agriculture is done by women. Women have all over the world, not just here, but indigenous women, particularly indigenous peoples, they have immense traditional knowledge of natural resources and how to take care of the commons. And these are very, very key to biodiversity preservation the world over. And women hold this knowledge and transmit it from generation to generation. When it comes to water provision, use, conserving water, supplying it for households, using it for the land, women play pivotal roles. Whether it comes to household or external water, as we know, women are the ones who go and fetch it and use it in the household. And there's increasing data to support that when it comes to a green economy and to conserving and circular economy, sustainable practices, women tend to be much more responsible consumers and supporters of a green transition. And also when it comes to climate-related conflict, women, much more than men, help to mitigate conflicts over water, land, resources, etc. So these are all the reasons to remember why women have vulnerabilities that are imposed on them, but they're not just a weak set of people who have to always be targeted as passive beneficiaries. Next slide, please. So some of the things that I just wanted to mention a few things that we have seen being done at the national level and also the community level when it comes to making climate adaptation strategies a bit more gender responsive. So during my work at the UNDP, we have supported these kinds of some of these kinds of activities for various countries. At the policy or the large policy level, of course, is the biggest issue and the most challenging issue is reforms for land title and registration. So this is something that has to be done at a national level, and it's not something that can be done externally by NGOs and development organizations. But of course, there's a big role in advocacy to move this. Without this, women's work will stay invisible. There's also the big issue of technologies and funding. So how far can we support women farmers, women-led agribusiness, and cooperatives to adapt to climate through the right kind of access to technologies and funding mechanisms? So these are some activities that development groups and organizations have been able to support. Again, at the large policy level is social protection mechanisms, which really have to expand in the face of extreme heat, drought, and flooding, so that women are able to support themselves with their natural source of livelihood is lost in agriculture. So there's a number of very good initiatives where women-led ecotourism businesses have flourished. And if there are small renewable energy projects where women can be trained, these have also had successes. It's very important to train women when it comes to climate adaptation to choose the right crops, drought-resistant, climate-smart crop and farming, how to manage resources in the face of extreme heat or extreme flooding, and what are all the adaptive technologies that they can access. Gender responsive budgeting in climate finance. We talked about climate finance during a big session recently at the ACJ. This is a very difficult topic, and when it comes to gender funding, you'll see how challenging it is. But this imperative that this has to be done at a global and national level. A very key issue is sex and age disaggregated data. What I find, and what you probably also found in any kind of policy documents or even in journalism and other reports, there are no people. I mean, they're just written for like in a vacuum. And even if there are people, they're never disaggregated. So we say, for example, in the land issue that was just discussed recently, which was extremely interesting, that women are the commons are being managed by the rural people. And then you have the big corporates coming in for the renewable energy projects. But who are they? Who's managing the commons? What does it mean to manage the commons? Who's doing the work? How does it cascade into their paid work, their unpaid work? So the sex and age disaggregated data is really critical to understand how climate change affects different groups of population at different times in their life cycle. And finally, and this is just not an exhaustive list, but just to say that women are generally absent at the decision-making level. So how far can women be given a seat at the table in climate policy formulation and implementation? These are some of the things that we have been trying to push at various levels, and it's a very critical area of work in India as well. Next slide, please. So here are some of the challenges. At the mega policy level, this is a very recent finding by UNDP, which they're still developing. It was at the recent announced at the recent Commission on the Status of Women in New York, that quite a sizable amount of the climate finance for gender equality is cancelled by tax incentives and subsidies. And I think we saw this in the discussion on land acquisition of land for large renewable energy projects, where governments tend to give big corporate subsidies to the people who are the corporations who are bringing in the so-called large projects. So whatever you do for women or for vulnerable populations at the ground, that tends to get cancelled out by these kind of overwhelming support for the large development. Very little of the climate finances reaches women or local initiatives. And again, the nationally determined contributions, which we can talk about a bit later, according to a recent Food and Agricultural Organization report, there's a minuscule amount of these NDCs, which are mandated, all governments have to produce them. Among 24 countries, very little of them have any mention of women. And very little bilateral funds also goes towards gender equality. So similarly, I don't want to go through everything, as you can see. And it's also quite striking that India's NDC, which was written as far back as 2021, at least from my quick reading of it, it doesn't have much mention of people and very little of rural challenges. There's a lot of smart cities, a lot of urban transformation, a lot of focus on urban areas, but very little of the vast agricultural and rural economy. Who is working on them, and how does India plan to support the climate impacts on this large population? Overall, when it comes to renewable energy and green transition sectors, sorry, not sections, there is an overwhelming male bias globally. And India's share of renewable energy jobs by some accounts is only 11% compared to about 33% globally. And the STEM areas of work are key to renewable energy and green jobs. And there is a STEM gender gap world over, in India as well. Even if it's quite not so pronounced at the educational level, it widens in the workplace. So the future is green. Green jobs and renewable energy is what is going to make climate change impacts less. And women are not visible here at all. And finally, I think everywhere, in most of the countries I have supported, most governments, implementing institutions at the state or national level lack the capacities and the data and the tools which helps them to monitor gender equality commitments and measure and deliver them. And the data, of course, is the key part of this. But there are various other indicators and systems that you have to set in place to make sure that the gender equality dimension of your climate work is not ignored. And also, there's a question of political will and accountability, which also is lacking in many places. Next slide, please. So just coming quickly to some suggestions on reporting. Next slide, please. It's really important to use gender as a lens and not as a category. So what do I mean by that? If you tend to look at gender conflated with women, which happens a lot of the time, then you'll just objectify women, and you will just have a lot of reporting that looks at them as being weak, needing to be empowered, giving them little grants and little things, microfinance, etc. So we don't want you to look at this huge thing that's happening in the world today, which is climate change, from this very narrow perspective. So use gender as a lens. So vulnerabilities to climate change are determined by a number of factors. Gender is one of them. Age and your wealth, which means multidimensional wealth, which is your income, your occupation, your education, your ability. All of these determine how much you can cope or be broken by climate change. Also, where you live, exactly where you live in the world, what is your location geographically, and where is your location locally? Are you rural? Are you peri-urban? Are you urban? And what in India, this is a huge issue, unfortunately, what ethnicity, what class or income group you come from. All these things determine your vulnerabilities. So the questions really to ask is, how does gender interact with all these or some of these other factors to create opportunity or disadvantage? So for example, if you're a man and you are in an extreme disaster event, say the extreme disaster event, you're a fisherman, and you're out at the sea, you could actually face a lot of threats. You could be drowned or something, but there is a possibility that you can swim. I'm just giving you a very quick example. But during a huge flooding, and we have seen this in countries like as far removed from India as Bosnia, women who stayed at home during massive floodings that occurred in 2014, women and girls, a lot of them lost their lives because they could not swim. And they could not really get away from the waters, and they were tied to the house because of care and other factors. So it's very important to look at gender as a lens, and increasingly now not man and women, but non-binary. You have to look at intersex, transgender, and various types of gender categories. So similarly, as I just said, you have a lot of ways in which different aspects of climate change will affect different people in rural areas in very different ways. So you have to look at it in a disaggregated way, both from a gender lens, but also from all these other perspectives, so that you look at disaggregated impacts and don't just give a monolithic report. And then I find this a really important point, which is who are the people? So if you're looking at a policy document, please look at who are the people the policy document is targeting. So take the NDC, take India's nationally determined contribution as an exercise, and look at who are they talking about. Are they talking about anyone at all? Or are they just talking about this policy in a vacuum? And then disaggregate them by all these factors and see what comes out. Next slide, please. So just finally, a few suggestions for a few questions, and I think Seema will be going into this, so I won't go into this in great detail. But from some of the examples I gave in terms of what are the challenges, what are some of the things that countries have done. So you can, as reporters, ask. Like, I think Archana asked this question for climate finance. She said, follow the money. And she said, who is winning? So this is a very, very key issue when it comes to climate action and gender responsive climate action. So it's very important to ask whether it's a renewable energy project, whether it's an ecotourism, whether it is a windmill, a solar project. You ask who gains from this and who loses and how. So if you start with that as your starting point, then all the other questions will follow. And these are some of the questions that you can ask your sources. Now, sources are just not, generally governments do not collect sex and age disaggregated data, or they don't share it. So it's very important as reporters to please ask. If they're giving you a policy initiative, ask them, do you have a population profile? Do you have how the population is disaggregated? And how far are adaptation programs embedding social and gender norms? I worked on a report recently with UNDP, and there's some very interesting examples in South Asia, in Bangladesh and Nepal, for example, where they actually brought in a lot of behavioral change methodologies as part of the climate action. So this meant in each rural household, trying to teach boys and men to share housework, to clean the yard, and for boys and men to understand the extent of work their sisters and mothers do, for them to accompany them on some of this, and to really understand that climate action is everybody's work in the household. So I think that was very, very useful. And what happens in a lot of development programming is that we just leave the social and gender norms aside, and we expect that to be managed by somebody else. But it's really key to put that into the work that we do. So again, who are getting jobs who are getting the green jobs? Who are getting the renewable energy jobs? Very few women are there. So why not? And most of the women who are there tend to be in administrative or non-technical positions. And that's a real problem, because the future will be for us to really surpass the climate challenge. Renewable energy and green jobs are absolutely key. And also, there's a lot of skills building. We have a lot of skills building programs in India at the national and state levels. Are these being targeted? Are these being targeted not only at women, but also at different sets of urban and rural populations? And are they really targeting climate adaptation? So I think these are some of the questions that you can ask, and you will come to a set of, you'll come to answers that are very different if you don't apply the gender lens. So finally, in conclusion, why is any of this important? Why should we do this? I think for all the reasons that we mentioned before, for fairness, for equity, and for understanding the work that women do, all over the world and in India, but also to build evidence. And evidence building is really key for policy making. Policymakers at national or global levels are not going to budge from advocacy, and they're not going to particularly care for gender advocates, human rights, or any other advocates. So why is it that so many of our global and national policies are so gender blind? They very often they say, where's the evidence? So although you have a lot of evidence for women in agriculture, the intersections of women in agriculture or gender considerations in agriculture, gender dimensions of climate change, and how climate change and climate adaptation is working to be gender responsive. These connections and this evidence building is still very much a work in progress. So I think building the evidence can be done by reporters, and by grassroots organizations, by NGOs and others. And this evidence building is fundamental to creating momentum for policy change. So that's why I think it's very important to look at the work that you're doing from these angles. So I will leave it there. Thank you. And just lastly, I'll just mention a couple of this next slide, please. You can look at some of these framework documents. I think many of you are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 5 is generally considered an accelerator for all the other goals. So if you have a look at it and see how it interacts with the relevant goals when it comes to climate. 13 is climate change. And then, of course, you have employment linked to climate change and to agriculture, as well as consumption and production, which affects climate change. So if you look at these together, you can get a sense of how each country is doing. The NDCs are mandatory under the Paris Agreement. Ours is not updated, but it's there for analysis. And a lot of the global conventions, both the UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Biodiversity Convention, require mandatory membership by signing on by governments, whereas the UN Sustainable Goals is an aspirational set of goals. These are conventions where governments have to sign on. So they have recently become much more gender responsive. So you can have a look at how the UNFCCC, for example, is advising gender actions. So what do they ask you to do, and how do they support national level work? And just recently you had the COP in Brazil, and the Belém Gender Action Plan also has a gender action plan. And what's also interesting is, I think in Brazil, water as a climate, as a water resilience and water governance came up as a very big focus at Belém. So that's something to look at in more detail. And lastly, I just leave you with some references that I used. Last slide, please. For this presentation, I'm happy to share others. And please also look at very, very fantastic organizations, which I'm sure Seema knows about at the ground level. In Maharashtra, for example, Swayam Shikshan Prayog, which was founded by a wonderful friend of mine who unfortunately is no more, Prema Gopalan. They do absolutely great work in empowering women farmers, lakhs of women farmers across Maharashtra and the West Coast region, in all these things that we talked about: technologies, access to climate adaptation, renewable energy, and they are those are some ways in which we can see what is being done from the ground up by organizations all over India. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bharti. That was wonderful and very insightful, as someone has said in the comments. And we just have announced, India has just announced its latest NDC, and I was reading it. And I think one of the things that related in some way to women was planting trees, Ek Ped Maa Ke Naam. Can't see anything more substantial than that for now. But Seema is going to speak a little more on that. And I welcome Seema Kulkarni to the session, and I'll just briefly introduce her. She's a well-known activist and a senior fellow of SOPECOM in Pune. She works on gender and rural livelihoods for a long time. with over 3 decades of experience. And she has worked extensively on gender and natural resource management, around water, land, sanitation. And she has also published extensively, contributing to books, peer-reviewed journals, and edited volumes. And she's the co-editor of 2 books. She's involved in the women's struggle in Sri Mukti Sangharsh Chalwal and related issues. She's also uh, a part of a key national platform called the Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, which has been campaigning for land rights and other basic, entitlements for women for a long time. And she's also part of the Feminist Policy Collective. And I can't think of a better person to speak on a ground level analysis of climate change and rural women. Seema, welcome, and I look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Meena. And I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Is fine?
Yes, good. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, thank you. And actually, Bharti has already sort of laid the background, and I do hope not to repeat some of the things that Bharti has already said in terms of, at least at the global level and the overview, the excellent overview that she's already given. So I'm going to actually use a few examples, and primarily from the state of Maharashtra, where I work, where we are, there are very visible impacts of climate change, but also cumulative impact of what we have seen, the way we have seen policies unfold as well, with reference to agriculture, water, and other natural resources. So I'm going to talk about women farmers more specifically. And of course, when we speak of women farmers, it is all of these. So it's not just the cultivators that we are talking about, but also the livestock rearers, the fisher folk, the forest producers or forest workers, agriculture laborers. So I think it's a spectrum of workers who are working in agriculture and allied activities. And I think this is also, very much stated in the National Farmers Policy of 2007, where we have a fairly expanded definition of who a farmer is. And I think women farmers, a much neglected category or completely unrecognized category, is where I'm trying to draw this attention, and which is also where Makam has constantly sort of campaigned and advocated. I mean, this is already something which has been said, and I think many of us already are following some of the data on participation of rural women in agriculture. And if we go, whether it is the census data or much more recent data sets that we are seeing about the periodic labor force data, we do see that a large majority of rural women are engaged in agriculture. So this is the census data of 2011, and we still await our next census. But clearly, it shows an overwhelming participation of women in agriculture. The recent periodic labor force data also shows that more than 75% of rural women in India are engaged in agriculture. We have the Time Use survey of 2019, which also shows a large part of a woman's day in the rural areas or otherwise is spent in unpaid or underpaid work, primarily care work, where we are talking about fetching water, fetching fuel, using that water for domestic and household activities. So a large part of the women's work day is spent in unpaid and invisible kind of work, which is unfortunately not accounted for. So on the one hand, we see a very high participation of women in agriculture, but much of that work is unpaid or underpaid work. The third slide that you see on this particular slide is also indicating in a way the paradox. So there is participation, overwhelming participation in agriculture, but what we see is when it comes to operational holding of land, unfortunately, no data in the public domain on how much land women really own. So this is really the agriculture census data, which for India, we see that it is not more than 13.8%. So of all the operational holders, only 13.8 are really female operational holders, operating about 11 or 12% of the land. So that's the story of participation and access to resources, whether it's land or other resources. But when we also look at credit, increasingly we are seeing, because of a number of initiatives of the government, women are encouraged to open accounts in banks in the formal system. But unfortunately, when it comes to access to credit, access to formal credit, specifically looking at the banking system, we do see that women's access to credit is really very, very minimal. In fact, all of the credit bundled together, this is data which has been sourced from the RBI and has been published in a paper by Pallavi Savan. We see that all the credit bundled together, it was not more than 8% for women. So while on the one hand, we are seeing that increasingly women are becoming depositors and do have individual bank accounts, their corresponding access to credit, unfortunately, is much lower than what you see for men. So, for example, credit received by women was just 27% of the deposits that they contributed, as against that for men, which was 52%. I think these are significant, gaps that we need to, or the lack that we need to understand when it comes to looking at the questions of women farmers, which further, of course, get aggravated by climate change and other policy changes that we are seeing. So, quickly, in a nutshell, when we are looking at gender gaps in the Indian context, we need to look at access to resources, labor. So, what part of that labor is unpaid, underpaid labor? What is the knowledge, skills, and what are the dominant discourses and narratives? Is women's knowledge even considered as knowledge? There, knowledge around seed, knowledge around cultivation, knowledge around rearing livestock, whose knowledge counts, I think, and what are the dominant discourses is also something that we need to pay attention to. And of course, the institutions of governance, where are the women, whether it is at the micro level or, at the meso and macro level. So all of this, in a way, has already created a certain kind of a disadvantage for women. We are looking at limited access to resources, to decision making, limited access to wages. The wage disparity is very high. And all of this, in a way, does have deep seated impacts on the lives of rural women, especially those from the marginalized and disenfranchised communities. So, this is already, the backdrop in which we are looking at how then climate change will play out. So very broadly, the impacts of climate change, I'm not going to go into great detail, but we see impacts at multiple levels. And, uh, uh, I will not detail out, of course, the different levels at which we are seeing these impacts. But clearly, if we were to broadly look at some of the impacts, and also how climate change discourse is also largely speaking of the extreme events or the rapid onset events, but paying little attention to the slow onset events, which I will be sharing a little more about. And these are droughts which have, over the years led to cumulative impacts where we see distress migration, we see farm suicides, we see forests depleting. So the slow onset events, unfortunately, don't get understood or seen as climate change events, and much of the attention is focused on the rapid onset events. But nonetheless, all of the impacts that we see, or whether they're human, social impacts, livelihood and food security impacts, and of course the environmental and ecological impacts. I think those are the immediate things that we see on the ground is that people have to sell their livestock, there is food insecurity, there is, loss of livelihoods. So all of these are impacts that we see on people, but also how, uh, you know, the rapid sort of depletion of whether it is water, forests, which again have impacts on, they're shaping people's lives and livelihoods. And of course, the impact on women is something that unfortunately has not received as much attention that it should. And here I would like to emphasize on the invisible care work. I think, this is the entire care economy, which is, of course, now because of a lot of discussion around that, is getting heard. But I think much more work needs to be done on what that unpaid care work is and how is it really contributing to the larger economy. What is that invisible layer which is in fact contributing to what we see as the visible economy. I think here we need to look at how household responsibilities are increasing. Lack of food means a direct impact on women's health. Lack of food also means increase in women's work to ensure that there is food on table, but it has deep-seated impacts on health, well-being, overall well-being, which also means that care work of women increases when it comes to taking care of, the households, the families. We've also seen increase in instances of early marriages, and this is, of course, the sugarcane story that I do hope to share, where we have seen that, there are instances of distress migration, which is also then accompanied by early marriages, whether it is because of suicides that happen, and therefore, there are school dropouts, and daughters, in fact, have to be married off early. So all of these are contributing in very, very significant ways to women's lives and to more specifically to rural livelihoods as well. Rather than me saying, talking about the whole farmer suicide, the concerns that we are seeing across the country, but Maharashtra, of course, has, reported the largest number of farmer suicides. Here's the story of a woman from a farmer suicide affected household and the spectrum of issues that she narrated.
5-7 वर्ष झाले असते, 8-9 वर्ष झाले लग्न झालेले. नंतर मुले झाले 2. ते दुष्काळ पडल्यामुळं मग आत्महत्या केली त्यांनी. 3-4 वर्ष पाऊसच नव्हता सलग. मग काही रानात 3 वर्ष पिकलंच नाही. वाहन घेतलं नाही, ती वाहन बी नाही, कर्ज ही महाग, बँकेचं लोन ही. मग ते काय फेडणं झालं नाही. थोडी शेती 2-3 एकर. मग काय होतंय, खायला तरी भागतंय का तेवढे. मग आत्महत्या केली त्यांनी. पण त्रास झाला, पण 2-3 महिने काय कळतच नव्हतं. असं काहीतरी झालंय, कुठं कशाचा धक्का बसला असं होत होतं. काय समजतच नव्हतं काही डोक्यात. मग सासरे आहेत, मग त्यांना थोडं समजून सांगून ही करून आपण असं करू तसं करू. लहान मुलं आहेत, मग त्यांच्या आधारावर सासरे आहेत, त्यांना समजून सांगितल्यावर जरा डोक्यात प्रकाश बी पडतोय ना. काही बी अडचणी आतापासून पाऊस नव्हता लागला, ती सर सोयाबीनचं गेलं पीक त्याच्यात. ही साऱ्या सोयाबीन उगून आल्या डबल. काय पाऊस साथ देत नाही, करायला घातली शेती तर घातलं शेतात तर ती बी निघत नाही त्याच्यात. कोणतंच नाही म्हणल्यावर खाऊन बी देत नाही, खावी नाही, बसावी नाही. ह्याच्याकून त्याच्याकून बी भरण आण, खतान पेर आलं रानात दिली पावसानं साथ दी, त्याचं महागारी नसतं राहिलं तसंच कर्ज. असं होतंय ना. भेटतंय आज नाही भेटत, उद्या मागास होती पेरणी, पुन्हा येत नाही, काही मागास झालं की. अशा अडचणी तर भरपूर आहे. शेतात करायचं म्हणल्यावर शेतकऱ्यालाच कळत आहे किती अडचणीत. आता जे हातात आहे तेवढं तर करतंय माणूस अडचणी सोडवण्यासाठी, पण नाही सुटल्यावर काय ती.
So this is, I mean, I won't go into the details because I'm aware that we are running short of time. But this is a question of, farmer suicides and the women who are left behind, who unfortunately the stories never get told. And this is a large number. In fact, I'm just sharing data until 2018, but updated data for 2022 shows that, from 1995 to about 2022, we have more than 90,000 farmer suicides that have been reported in Maharashtra, and around 10% are those of, by women. Unfortunately, we've never had data kept for women because women have never been recognized as farmers because they don't own land. And if there is a large number of suicides, and the women who are left behind, unfortunately, are only seen as widows of these farmers. So I think this is an area that we need to be paying attention to. And these farmer suicides cannot only be seen as agrarian distress, which is seen in a vacuum and not understood in the larger context of both the policy changes, the systemic changes, but also how climate change is actually aggravating their lives. Similar is the story of sugarcane workers. I will not show this video, but it will be here for you. The presentation will be shared. But again, this is the story of sugarcane workers who migrate every season for about 6 months, starting from October until, let's say, March or April for the entire sugarcane season. It is the women who are not, again, seen as workers, as harvesters, who, I mean, this is all again slow onset events where distress migration in some of these areas has been on the rise. Uh, Distress migration, which also has meant that people are displaced from their homes into destination areas. They work as what is referred to as the koitas. And you may have heard stories of the hysterectomies among women sugarcane workers, some of the extreme sort of examples of what climate-induced migration or what agrarian distress has meant for the women workers. This is Sumantai, who's talking about how her life and for 3 generations, what it has meant for her. And she's hoping that at least her 4th generation doesn't mean that, the young girls at the age of 13, 14 are getting married just simply so that there is an economic unit that is formed for, sugarcane harvesting. Now, the spectrum of issues that, workers like Suman face range from early marriage to hysterectomies to very poor conditions at work, leading to very, very deep-seated impacts on their health and livelihoods. So this is, the story of sugarcane workers, young children going at work sites and facing a number of problems just so that, there is profit for sugar factories. So I think this is a larger systemic issue that also needs to be understood. Let's quickly look at, what has been, what are the frameworks that we see in terms of climate policies and climate, what are the global frameworks? Bharti has already discussed some of them, but gender is really completely missing. And specifically looking at migration, because we know that climate change has meant displacement, has meant distress migration globally. But unfortunately, we see very, very little focus on women workers. We also see very little focus on migration. In terms of the National Action Plan on Climate Change, again, what we see is that gender is invisible at the core. So the flagship climate policy makes little or no mention of women or gender. There is a clear technocratic bias. So there is a focus on energy, infrastructure, efficiency. But what really has it meant to the care work or the lived experiences and realities of women, of people, has actually been completely erased. So women's labor has been erased. Migration as a gendered issue has been erased. So there are a lot of gaps when it comes to gender in the policy framework at the global as well as at the national level. So there is talk, but the talk really has realized very little in terms of what has come at the policy levels. And these are some of the examples when we come to, very concrete programs and policies. Very little time right now. But if you look at, for example, the POKRA, which is considered as a climate resilience program in Maharashtra, or in Telangana, the Harita Haram or the Mission Bhagirath, all of these programs are talking about making shifts to the green. But unfortunately, there is very, very little about people. There is very little about the broader systemic changes or the public investments that are required. And all of them, unfortunately, all of these programs narrow down to farm level, individual level, with few public investments, which will actually address the larger question of climate change. There are a lot of civil society initiatives, and Bharti has mentioned the SSP program in Maharashtra. Across the country, there are a number of initiatives that need to be highlighted. So when it comes to what kind of reporting we do, on the one hand, of course, we need to talk about the deprivation, the vulnerabilities, but there are also positive stories that are emerging in terms of what could be considered as climate resilient agriculture. So I think these are stories that are from Maharashtra, where efforts are being made by women's collectives, women's groups that are talking about what really needs to be changed. And these are larger systemic changes. So yes to women's recognition in agriculture, but also a big no to the larger paradigms that we are seeing in terms of the green revolution model, the larger mainstream paradigms that women are challenging alongside of whether it is caste, class, patriarchy. So I think the social structures on the one hand, but also the economic models, development models that really need to change. And I think that's the change that we need to be looking for. I will not spend much time on recommendations which are already stated, but they are there here for all of you. The presentation will stay. But let me come to directly to spend about 2 or 3 minutes on how we really need to start telling stories. And I think coming from a network, from an organization that is constantly looking for the evidence that is being gathered by reporters, which is very, very valuable for us, because for our campaigns, for our advocacy, what you do as ground reporting is important for the work, for visibilizing the work that many of us are also trying to, do. So moving really beyond events, I think telling those systemic stories is very important. So the extreme events do get covered, but what does it mean for, the people on the ground? How are they facing the everyday climate stress due to slow onset of events, whether it's drought, migration, debts, the microfinance stories that we're hearing, but connecting them with, the larger onset of events that we see. Also looking at, of course, policy announcements, but to see the connections with lived realities. So I think that becomes very important. What is also important is, of course, the agrarian distress and what that has meant in terms of loss of livelihoods, but what it has meant in terms of the labor relations, what it has meant in terms of women's work, women's care work, and the survival stories. So just to give you an example of sugarcane workers, the care work, the 17, 18 hours of work that is being put by sugarcane workers, and the additional care work that they are putting in by, the work that is being put in by women, what it has meant in terms of survival of those households, and the larger narrative around lives and livelihoods is also, I think, important, moving from gender neutral narratives to the gendered impacts. So here the question is really about who's doing the work, who has access to resources, but who really is bearing the cost. And I think the gendered narratives would start becoming very prominent. So again, to repeat, disaggregate by gender, disaggregate by caste, class, and location. So who's working on the farms, who's migrating, who's staying back, whose time, all of these are extremely important voices that need to be heard, and stories that need to be told. I think the risk is also something which is getting played out in a number of ways, health, violence, but also the early marriages that we are seeing. And those are stories that need to be linked with changes that we are witnessing on the ground with reference to climate change. So these are, the stories that we really want to hear much more in terms of, what is not really being reported, whether it is farmer suicides, the migration stories, but also the positive stories of what women are doing, the women-led alternatives, agroecology based alternatives, but also the everyday adaptations. Just to give you example, adaptation can also be a distress migration, but adaptation can also be uh, how they're changing the way they farm, for example, or how they're changing the way they're collecting the forest produce, how they're changing the way they're doing fishing. I think all of these are also extremely important reporting that will critically tell you how women's everyday lives are being led. And I think one of the important things that I always reiterate in all my presentations is highlighting care work. And care work is infrastructure. Often we look at infrastructure as roads, as irrigation, as, the physical infrastructure that needs to be there for farmers to survive. But I think looking at care work as infrastructure, all the labor of women, of the poor, also needs to be highlighted. And I think that is the story that clearly is missing, and we really need to speak about that. So finally, on my last slide, I think it's finally about making women visible. What are the principles? Centering their lived experiences, reporting on structural issues of land, labor, caste, access, and what are the policy gaps. And also following stories over time, which I think many of you do, and those are wonderful stories to hear. So it's not just the crisis, but just follow the woman over the entire season, over years. I think it's those longitudinal studies or stories that come from all of you are also far more interesting to hear because they actually report about the slow onset and not just the extreme events. So, importantly, climate change is not gender neutral, and leaving you with just this message that reporting shouldn't either. And these are all the references, they're all there for you. Uh, Thank you very much, and really sorry for overstepping time.
Thank you so much, Seema. No, you didn't overstep. It's all right. I mean, it's a huge topic, and I think both of you did enormous justice to it. I'll quickly go to the questions. I think, Bharti, the first question is for you. Have you managed to read it, or should I read it out to you? Question from Eliza.
Eliza, yeah.
My question is for Bharti. It's important to highlight women's agency and to acknowledge initiatives by various organizations that support rural women. At the same time, how can reporters avoid giving disproportionate visibility to particular NGOs? What steps can journalists take to assess whether an NGO's work is genuinely substantive and community driven rather than instrumentalizing women to meet donor agendas?
Well, it's a good question. It's not an easy question, but I think as a reporter, first of all, you have a shortage of time. So it would be very difficult for you to analyze, the extent to which an NGO is doing its work right. So my way of looking at this would be to focus less on the NGO and to focus on the people that they are supporting and to go directly to speak to some of them. And in the development jargon, we call it stakeholder mapping, which means you look at who are the people who are being affected by this work. Who does the NGO or the organization reach out to, and how do they reach out to them over some time? So I think it's important not to just look at the particular project or the thing on hand, but to look at whether there has been a change in that person's life cycle approach, whether they've really improved coping strategies of a community, has training and capacities really made them more autonomous. There are many indicators that you can look for, and not prioritize so much the NGO itself. And to some extent, I think the so-called instrumentalizing of women is maybe not such a bad thing, because women are so invisible, as we just saw. So if you can do something for women, even in a targeted way, it is something to not to poo-poo, but also obviously to see that it's not just very time-based, but it has a longer time approach. I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Yeah, it is and also I feel single source stories are being vastly discouraged now. So I mean, all of us tend to do that, take one thing and make a story out of it, but also to kind of multiply your sources and look at other if you have, but like Bharti said, often we are all constrained by deadlines and resources. Quickly to the next question. There's a year of farmers dedicated to women farmers. Does it give more space to talk of invisible labor and women's contribution to agriculture? Seema, you want to go?
Yeah. I mean, yes and no. Yes, of course, because suddenly there is a lot of attention from the mainstream as well. We recently had a large conference organized by the ICAR and the Ministry of Agriculture, which was dedicated to the International Year of the Women Farmers, where more than 100 women farmers participated, etc. So that's good in a way. But unfortunately, it should not just be a year where you're celebrating, but not really recognizing the work that women are doing and drawing up policies and programs which are focused on, some of the concerns that many of the women farmers organizations and groups are raising. So I think, in a way, globally, internationally, this is an important year for all of us doing work with women farmers. And at multiple levels, I think all of us need to ensure that it gets into the mainstream, but also the narratives in the mainstream are challenged, because otherwise it may just end up, as a very tokenistic kind of a year, like the way every year we see celebrations on the National Women Farmers Day, which happens on 15th of October, where we have some awards given out to, women farmers, but not really looking at the key issues that are being constantly raised. So we are all looking forward to this year, and we are pushing at government level, at our own campaign level to, get the agenda of invisible work, definitely on the table. So.
Great. Madhavi, I saw your hand up. You want to ask your question? I see that you've typed it in chat, but you're welcome to unmute and ask the question if you wish.
That is the question for Bharti actually. So I have another question for Seema actually. So I like to ask that question.
Sure.
One second. Seema, thank you. Excellent presentation actually. I was struck by the paradox you highlighted. On the one hand, over 75% of rural women are engaged in agriculture. Yet their ownership of land, access to credit, and recognition as farmers remain extremely limited. So how do you explain this structural disconnect between participation and control over resources? And to what extent do current agriculture or climate policies reinforce rather than challenge this invisibility of women's labor?
I think the explanation is very much in the structural issues, because I think the way our society is organized around, patriarchy, caste, ethnicity, and all of these differences actually shape our lives in a way. So who owns resources is very clear, I mean, even so it is the men who own resources, but even among the men, caste, and other forms of social discrimination play a very, very significant role. Then, when we look at the whole architecture of agriculture programs or any of the natural resources, whether it's forests or water, we see this entire architecture is around ownership of land. So, who has access to water? Who has access to all the agricultural schemes and programs, whether it is, the direct cash transfers like the PM Kisan or even the crop insurance programs. It's all with those who own land. So that is actually, unfortunately, the reality where, on the one hand, you have, all the normatives, the social structures which are determining access to resources. And those social structures, in fact, become the basis of also designing how your programs and how your policies will actually be shaped. So clearly, who does the work? All of, again, our, the systemic or the gender stereotypes or the social conditioning is around, again, the work has to be done by who? It's very clear that all of the care work, unfortunately, gets done by women or by communities. So all of the survival subsistence agriculture, for example, becomes the onus of, let's say, the Adivasis or the smallholders. So all of that, then the work gets done by the most vulnerable. And among the most vulnerable, it is the women who are responsible for care work, fetching water, ensuring that there is food on the table. So if there is a monocrop and, if you're only growing cotton or soybean or maize, it is the women who have to ensure that somehow or the other spaces are carved out to grow food or to scavenge for that food. Number of examples in our, cotton growing areas where we've seen women work that or walk that extra mile to ensure that there is food on the table. So after a crop is harvested, let's say the chana crop is harvested, she would actually walk that farm just so that she can scavenge for some food to be on her table. So I think this is the care work that we are seeing for women, but without access to any of the resources. So all of this feminization of agriculture is unfortunately under adverse conditions. And this has to change, right? I mean, the tables have to turn. We cannot be looking at people who are doing unpaid work but lack access to resources or lack access to decision making. So that's, I think, that has to be flagged and that has to change. One of our demands is that irrespective of ownership to land, irrespective of ownership to other resources, we need to design our programs and policies so that those who are actually doing the work have a say in policies, programs, and also have access to resources. So I think that's the point of advocacy that organizations like ours or many of us are striving for and achieving.
Thank
That
you
was
so
one
much.
question. Yeah, I hope I have answered. You
Yeah,
also
thank
had
you so
another
much.
question, right? Okay.
You have a question for Bharti, or is this answered? Because I noticed some overlap.
Well, just quickly, Madhavi, on the green jobs, I think the structural issues in terms of structural barriers in education, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there are that many structural barriers in education for women to study STEM, unless, of course, I mean, the education is open. I think the barriers are more within the family and, other kinds of constraints that women maybe place on themselves. So I don't have the data in front of me, but I think the STEM gap is not so bad at the education level, but it really widens at the work level. And a lot of that comes again back to care. The care work and the fact that women and girls have to take on certain roles by certain age. Then they have the marriage and childbearing, the motherhood penalty and all that. That becomes a big disadvantage, sort of, what do you say, a discouraging thing for many employers. This is not to, support the employers, but there is a lot of discrimination right from the onset in the workplace, even for qualified women, because of what the employers see will be a lot of absenteeism from the job and, in ways that they don't see for men. So I think a huge amount of work in workplace education, employer education, and there are some quite interesting global markers called the Gender Equality Seal for public and private enterprises, which the UN does, the World Bank does. So an organization that signs on to it has to cut out a lot of these discriminatory policies, both in recruitment, in promotions, in capacity building, and so forth. So I think there has to be a huge push by the educators, by families, by women and girls themselves, and definitely by employers to give women the openings in these tech sectors, which are really the future and will change, a lot of things for us in climate impacts. And I just want to quickly say that in terms of the Year of the Farmer, it's really if we can do even a little bit with the government to make some of the policies less technocratic and make them look at all the lived experiential realities of women, that would be a huge change, to not have all the documents at national and state level focusing only on MRTS and, high speed, this and that. And, I mean, it's completely without any consideration for the women and the poor who are bearing the brunt of a lot of climate change. I have another question.
And
I just have Preeti had a question on caste.
Yeah.
Caste and in the world of women farmers, if either of you would like to take a stab at it. Seema?
Yeah, thanks for that question. In fact, the entire uh, story of the sugarcane workers is around caste, and I think clearly, caste in a way, uh, caste intersects. Caste is how our society is organized, and we clearly see, the uh, experiences also being shaped by that. Just to give you an example of some of the women farmers we are working with, and of course also the sugarcane workers. Large majority of the sugarcane workers are from among the Dalit community in Maharashtra. Also earlier the nomadic tribes, but primarily today it is the Dalit women and men. Of course, they work in couples, and these are also, of course, the landless. So a large labor supply for sugarcane work is from among the Dalit landless, and the experiences that the structural violence that they face as women, but also as women workers, is something that is very, very evident from the experiences that they've shared. For example, they migrate for a period of 6 months, and not only is the work that they engage in, which is 14, 15, 16 hours, but the violence that they face for being both a Dalit and a woman uh, are stories that are very, very stark. And these are usually the destination villages where, they migrate for a period of 6 months, where there are very few support systems that they would have. Being Dalits, it is also very difficult for the entire community, the migrant community, to also speak out. So these are, very deeply entrenched caste relations, which make it very difficult to survive as workers, as women workers. So while this is one kind of an example, among the cultivators that we are working with, we have, very often seen how uh, any agricultural operation is a very timely, all agricultural operations have to be very timely. So the pre-sowing, you need all your agriculture, let's say if it is plowing or any pre-sowing kind of activities, have to be made available in a very timely manner. Now, some of our women who are part of these agroecology collectives, one of the biggest constraints that the Dalit women have shared with us is that very often we are the last recipients of these agricultural, whether it's the tractor or the plow, the bullocks that come. And this has a significant impact on the overall production. Now, just being a Dalit means that you become, the last recipient of all these agricultural services, and how that has an impact on your productivity. Now, these are never issues that would be considered as part of, all of your productivity and production calculations in the agriculture sector. That you are a woman, that you are a Dalit, and therefore all of these factors can affect how production also happens. So all your MSP, all your agricultural policies will never consider social structures. And this is where caste, patriarchy become very significant, and the need to differentiate not just access, but also everyday lived experiences of these people. So I think caste plays a very critical role, and I can give you a number of examples of how, when work is actually declining, we're talking of a monocropping where there is concentration of work only in particular seasons. And that also means, again, another paradox where you need labor. There is a labor shortage, and the rest of the year there is no work for laborers. And again, here we've seen that there is a Dalit discrimination where labor availability itself is low. Who are the first then to be employed in a typical village scenario? And here we have seen caste discrimination play out very significantly. So a number of such experiences only get seen when you are sensitive about social structures and how they're impacting daily lives of people. But otherwise, it's just a sectoral issue, for everyone else. But for us, or for people, for those who are living it, it's not just a sectoral issue of agriculture, but it's about who I am and why I'm being treated in the way that I'm being treated, and how that affects my life and livelihood. So,
Thank you,
yeah.
Seema. That was very insightful. I just want to say that so many of the problems that we face with climate change is due to structural and fundamental issues which have not been resolved, especially in our society. Like caste, patriarchy. These are persistent and all-pervasive issues which, get exacerbated by climate change. So I feel it's quite an uphill task, when you're just talking of green jobs, when you're not resolving the whole structural aspect of society. There's one question for Bharti. Please quickly explain why women are less likely to migrate because of climate change.
I think we've gone over this now and all what we talked about. And
Yeah.
Seema will be able to say more
And
from actual
okay.
examples. Obviously, it's care work, care responsibilities, household responsibilities, which fall primarily on women. So they're not able to just get up and go somewhere else for a better job, for better income. And a seasonal migration could be with families. But when it comes to single migration, it's almost always men. In many cases, men don't return. And it's the remittances, that they can get from men that keeps the women going and the families going. But that's why the whole issue of the care burden and the disproportionate farming and non-farming burden that falls on women is such a big issue because of the overwhelmingly, if I'm not wrong, male migration to non-farm jobs.
The last question we'll take is for Seema. Have you encountered stories of gender diverse, non-binary individuals intersecting with climate?
That's a very, very important question, actually. But unfortunately, our focus now clearly, we are making an effort to at least try and speak, understand, what the concerns are. But what we've also noticed, and I suppose that's true everywhere, is that the rural space is extremely hostile to gender diverse and non-binary. So we have seen movement out of rural areas of, the gender diverse and the, so that is, but there have been some stories, and we have heard just in a few villages where we are now actually actively trying to understand what is happening, where are they, why do we not see them really in the rural context. One of the reasons is the hostility itself, but we have seen that wherever there have been efforts where they have tried to claim land, we have seen hostility of a very different kind, and it is not easy. And I think we are also struggling as Makam also to bring on board some of the issues of gender diversity, the non-binary question. But just to respond here, that we are mindful of it, but I don't think I really have an answer in terms of do we have a research or do we have evidence? So right now, no. Just a few examples that I shared with you.
Great. I think we'll close the session now. Thank you very much, Seema and Bharti. Obviously, there's a lot that is left to be said, but I think in this short time, you both managed to, I think, give a very broad and a very good perspective, an elaborate perspective, I would say, a framework for what's missing and what needs to be covered. And all those from the ACJ who are attending this, I hope this can feed into some of the stories that you will planned in this program. And I think as experts, you can always contact both Seema and Bharti. They're available. We can share numbers and also the presentation. And thank you, Preeti, Pritish, and ACJ, Srini especially, for all the technical support. And have a nice day. Bye.